The machines kept him alive, but it was a stranger's voice that kept him company. For 4 months, a woman named Tessa Wills came to room 412 of Belhaven General every evening. After her shift, sat in the hard plastic chair beside a man she had never met, awake, and read to him until the night nurse turned the corridor lights down. She did not know his name. The chart at the foot of the bed said John Doe. The police had found him on the gravel shoulder of Route 9. No wallet, no phone, no one calling the hospital to ask where he was. She had no idea who he was, no idea whether he could hear her, and no idea that the words she spent into that quiet room would one day be the only thread a man could follow back to the surface of his own life. She was 34 years old. She mops the floors of the 3rd and 4th floors of Belhaven for $11 an hour, and she had 2 children at home who needed her in ways that did not pause for a stranger in a coma. There was nothing in her job that asked her to sit with him. There was nothing in her paycheck that paid for it. She did it anyway, and if you have ever wondered whether the small things a person does when no one is watching ever come back around, stay with me, because this one came back in a way no one saw coming. Tessa had grown up 2 streets from the hospital where she now worked. Her mother had cleaned the same building before her, knees worn out by 60, and Tessa had grown up understanding that some people are paid to be invisible and learn to carry their dignity in private. She married young to a man named Dexter, who drove long-haul routes and was gentle when he was home and gone too often to be much of a father. And when the marriage ended, it ended quietly, the way a fire goes out when no one feeds it. There was no great betrayal in it, no scene worth telling at a kitchen table, only a slow accumulation of empty chairs at empty dinners, until one day the leaving was already finished, and all that remained was to say so. She kept the children. She kept the apartment on Holloway Street with the radiator that knocked all winter, a sound she had learned to sleep through, and then, after Dexter left, a sound she found herself grateful for, because a knocking radiator is at least a thing in the room with you in the dark. She kept going. She had decided a long time ago that bitterness was a weight she could not carry up 4 flights of stairs along with the groceries and a sleeping child, and so she had set it down, and she did not pick it back up. And that decision was the quiet engine of everything good that her life still held. The 2 children were her whole architecture. Marcus was 9, serious and watchful, a boy who organized his shoes by color and worried about money in a way no 9-year-old should have to. He had a habit of standing at the kitchen window on the 1st of the month watching the mailbox, because he had once seen his mother go quiet at a white envelope, and he had decided, in the private logic of a child, that white envelopes were the enemy and that he would be the one to spot them first. Tessa had caught him at it one morning, and had not known whether to laugh or to weep, and had done a little of both in the bathroom with the fan on. Joy was 6, named on purpose, a child who laughed at the ceiling fan and brought home drawings of houses with too many windows. She drew the windows large and yellow, the way a child draws warmth, and she taped them to the refrigerator until the refrigerator was a wall of bright, impossible houses, and Tessa left every one of them up. Tessa worked the 2 to 10 shift so she could walk Marcus and Joy to school in the mornings, holding a hand on each side, down Holloway Street past the shuttered laundromat and the church with the cracked steps, and her sister Renee took the children in the evenings until Tessa got home, smelling of disinfectant and bone-tired and grateful. Rennie had 3 of her own and a husband who worked nights, and the 2 sisters ran their households on a single rope thrown back and forth between them, watching each other's children, splitting the cost of a warehouse store sack of rice, trading the one good winter coat that fit either of their oldest boys. It was a life held together by other people's kindness and her own refusal to quit. It was not much. It was hers, and she did not let herself want more than she had, because wanting was a luxury that cost more than $40, and she could not afford the spending. The man in 412 came into her life on a Tuesday in October. She was emptying the trash bins along the 4th floor corridor when she heard one of the day nurses, a woman named Carla, talking low to another about the patient nobody had claimed. 4 days he had been there, Carla said, and not one phone call. No family, no name. They were calling him John Doe, and the word had a loneliness in it that stopped Tessa in the hall with the trash bag still in her hand. She looked through the door. He was a big man, or had been, hollowed now by the stillness of the bed, his face slack and grey under a week of beard. Tubes ran into his arm and his throat. A monitor counted his heart in green numbers. There was no card on the windowsill, no balloon, no folded coat over the chair, none of the small evidence that someone, somewhere, was waiting for him to come back. The room was clean and silent and absolutely empty of love, and Tessa Wills stood in the doorway and felt something turn over in her chest. That night she could not stop thinking about him. She lay in her bed on Holloway Street with the radiator knocking and thought about a man lying in a room with no one to tell him the world was still out there. She thought about how she would feel if it were Marcus grown, hurt on a road somewhere far from home, and no one came. She did not have money to give him, she did not have power or a name to clear his way. She had a voice, and she had a paperback she kept in her locker for the bus, and the next evening after she clocked out, she went back up to the 4th floor instead of going home. She told no one in the hospital anything. She slipped into room 412, sat down in the plastic chair, opened the paperback to the first page, and in a low and even voice, she began to read to a man who could not hear her, or so everyone believed. The book was a worn copy of a seafaring novel, the kind with a cracked spine and a lighthouse on the cover, and she read 4 pages and felt foolish the whole time. When she finished, she sat for a moment in the hum of the machines and said, almost to herself, that she would come back tomorrow. Then she went home and made grilled cheese and helped Marcus with his fractions and did not tell her children where she had been. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and somewhere in the second week the foolishness wore off and the visits became the truest 20 minutes of her day. She read him the whole seafaring novel and started another. She told him about her shift, about the spill on the 2nd floor and the new floor, wax that smelled like cough drops. She told him Joy had lost a tooth and put it under the pillow and demanded to know the going rate, and that Tessa had slid 2 quarters under the pillow at midnight, and Joy had announced at breakfast that the tooth fairy was cheaper than last year, and the economy must be bad. She told him Marcus had made the honor roll, and she had cried in the laundry room so the children would not see, standing between the dryers with the warm metal at her back, letting the spin cycle cover the sound. She read him the newspaper when she found one in the break room, the weather and the box scores and the small county news, so that a man with no name would at least know what day it was in the world he had fallen out of. When she found a crossword half done, she read him the clues and guessed at the answers and told him he could correct her if he knew better. And the joke of it, a man in a coma correcting a crossword, made her smile in the empty room, and the smiling felt like a small disloyalty to her own exhaustion that she decided to allow herself. The night nurses learned to expect her. One of them, an older woman named Pat, started leaving the good chair pulled out, the one with the cushion, so Tessa's back would not ache. Pat had worked that floor for 26 years and had buried more patients than she let herself count, and she had a rule she had made long ago about not getting attached, and she broke it for the floor cleaner and the John Doe without quite admitting she had. She started saving the warm blanket from the bottom of the cart for 412. She started on the coldest nights bringing Tessa a paper cup of the bad break room coffee and setting it on the windowsill without a word, which is how women who are too tired for speeches say that they see you. What she did not know, what no one in that building knew, was who the man in 412 actually was. His name was Walter Brennan, and he was not a John Doe at all. He was the founder and majority owner of Brennan Freight, a trucking and logistics company that ran 900 trucks across 11 states, a company that had started 40 years earlier with one second-hand rig and a man too stubborn to fail. Walter was 61 years old, worth on paper something north of $200 million, and on the night he ended up on the shoulder of Route 9, he had been doing the one thing his lawyers and his board and his late wife had all begged him never to do. He had been driving alone at night in an unmarked car with no security and no phone. He bothered to answer because the anniversary of his wife's death made him restless, and he could not stand the silence of his enormous house. A drunk driver crossed the center line near the county line and ran him into the ditch and kept going. Walter's car was an old sedan he kept for sentimental reasons registered to a holding company under a name no clerk would recognize. He carried no wallet that night, only his keys, because he had told himself he was only going for a drive. By the time a passing trucker found the wreck and called it in, Walter Brennan, one of the wealthiest men in the state, had become a nameless body on a gravel shoulder, and the machinery of his vast and careful life had no idea where he had gone. His company assumed he had taken one of his disappearances, the long, unannounced trips he sometimes took to clear his head. His estranged daughter, Camille, who had not spoken to him in 3 years, assumed nothing because she had stopped waiting for him to call. For nearly a week no one looked, and the man who had built an empire lay in a county hospital under a stranger's name, while a floor cleaner read him chapters of a book about the sea. Tessa knew none of this. To her he was simply the man who needed company, and she gave it freely. And that is the thing the wealthy so often forget. The people who clean their floors and empty their bins and sit with their dying are watching them be human in ways their boardrooms never will. And they are keeping a kind of ledger the wealthy cannot see. By the second month, Tessa had started to talk to him about the things she told no one. She told him about Dexter, about how it felt to be the one who stayed. She told him she was scared sometimes that the rent had gone up $40 and she did not know where the $40 would come from. She told him she was tired in a way sleep did not fix. She said these things into the quiet because the quiet could not judge her, and because some part of her had decided that the man in the bed was on her side. And she was right about that, in a way she could not yet imagine. She also noticed things the nurses were too busy to notice. She noticed when his hand twitched during a sad chapter. She noticed that his heart numbers ticked up a little when she laughed. She mentioned it once to Carla, who smiled the tired smile of a person who had seen too many families read meaning into reflexes, and said the body did all kinds of things on its own. Maybe so. Tessa kept reading anyway. She had come to believe, without proof, that somewhere down in the dark he was listening, and that belief was its own kind of faithfulness. There was a doctor on the case, a neurologist named David Okafor, a calm and careful man, who had quietly come to look forward to seeing the cleaner in 412 each evening. He had told the family of more patients than he could count that recovery from a coma was not a movie, that voices did not pull people back the way the films pretended, that the brain healed on its own slow chemistry, or it did not heal at all. He believed that. He had the scans to prove it. He had also been doing this long enough to respect the things medicine could not measure, and he never once told Tessa to stop. Instead, he started timing his late rounds to overlap with her visits, and he watched the green numbers when she read, and he charted what he saw without drawing a conclusion he could not defend, because he was a careful man. There was a variability in the patient's responses. On the evenings the cleaner came that he could not have written into a paper, and could not quite dismiss either, a heart rate that settled, a blood pressure that eased. Once during a chapter where a sailor wept for his lost ship, a single tear that ran from the corner of the patient's closed eye, which Okafor knew was very likely the ordinary mechanics of a body, a duct doing its dull work, and which he found he could not watch without looking away. He said nothing to Tessa. He did not want to give her a hope the data would not carry. He only kept coming, and kept watching, and kept wondering whether the thing he had told all those families was as true as he had always needed it to be. 3 weeks before Christmas, the hospital's billing office began making the calls that hospitals make about patients who cannot pay. An unidentified man with no insurance and no family was a problem with a dollar figure attached, and the figure was climbing past 200,000, and there was talk, the kind of talk that happens in offices Tessa never entered, about transferring him to a county long-term facility where the reading chair and the cushion and the floor cleaner would not follow. Tessa heard about it the way she heard about everything, sideways, in a corridor, 2 administrators in good shoes talking over her cart, as though the cart pushed itself. The county place was 40 minutes away, out past the interchange, a low brick building she had driven past once, and never forgotten, the kind of place where the unclaimed go to be kept rather than healed. She knew what a transfer meant. It meant the file got thinner, and the visits stopped, and the man became a line in a ledger, in a building no one drove to, and the small daily insistence that he was a person, that he mattered, would simply end, because no one was paid to insist it. It frightened her more than she expected. She had no standing to stop it. She was not family. She was not anyone. She was just the woman who came every day, and the system did not have a line item for that. She thought about asking Dr. Beer Okar fought to intervene and could not bring herself to, because she had learned long ago that asking important people for favors was a way of handing them a reason to remember you were nothing, and she would rather keep her place than spend her dignity on a no. She went home that night and sat at her kitchen table after the children were asleep and did something she had never done. She wrote a letter. She did not know who she was writing to exactly, the hospital board or God or the man himself, so she addressed it to no one, and she wrote that the man in 412 was a person, that he mattered, that somewhere he had a life and people who would grieve him if they knew, and that moving him to a place where no one knew his face would be a kind of giving up that she could not be part of. She wrote that she would keep coming wherever they sent him if she could find the bus that reached it. She read it back, and it sounded like a woman with no power begging a wall, and she folded the letter and put it in her locker and did not send it because there was no one to send it to, and she went back to the only thing she could do. She kept reading. If you have ever done the right thing in a room where it changed nothing, where no one thanked you and no result came of it, you know the particular ache of that faithfulness, and you know why she could not stop. So she didn't. It was the second week of January when the world finally came, looking for Walter Brennan, a private investigator named Lottie Graves, hired by the company's board after 11 weeks of an absence that had stopped looking like a vacation and started looking like a disappearance, traced a series of dead ends back to the wreck on Route 9, and from the wreck to a county hospital, and from the hospital to an unidentified male patient of the right age and build who had been admitted the night Walter vanished. She drove out to Belhaven on a grey Tuesday with a photograph in her hand, and she walked onto the 4th floor, and she stopped a nurse and asked to see the John Doe in 412. Tessa was in the room when the investigator came. She was reading the last chapter of a book about a man who sailed home after 20 years away, and she looked up when the door opened, and she saw a woman in a wool coat holding a photograph, and she watched the woman look from the photograph to the bed and back, and she watched the colour leave the woman's face. "That is Walter Brennan," the investigator said. "Oh, my God! That is Mr. Brennan." The room changed in an instant. By that afternoon, there were lawyers in the corridor and a vice president from the company on the phone and a hospital administrator who suddenly knew exactly who was lying in 412 and exactly how that bill would be paid. The man with no name had a name now, and the name moved through the building like weather, and the cushioned chair and the floor cleaner who sat in it were swept to the edges of a story that had abruptly become important. Tessa stood in the hall while strangers in good coats filled the room she had filled for 4 months, and she felt the old familiar thing, the feeling of being made invisible by people with money, and she gathered her cart and went back to her floors because there was nothing else for her to do. She thought that was the end of it. She thought she would read about him in the paper, the recovered millionaire, and she would know she had been the one who sat with him when he was no one, and that would have to be enough because it always had been before. The man in the bed was not finished surprising anyone. Walter Brennan had not been as far down in the dark as the machines believed. For weeks he had been swimming up through a black and weightless place, and the only fixed point in all, that nothing, the only star he could steer by, was a voice. A woman's voice, low and even, reading to him about the sea. He did not know whose voice it was, he did not know where he was or what had happened to him. He knew only that every evening the voice came back, and that it spoke to him as though he were a person and not a problem, and that it told him about a boy named Marcus who made the honor roll, and a girl named Joy who lost a tooth, and about a radiator that knocked, and about being tired in a way sleep did not fix. The voice had become, in the absence of everything else, the shape of his will to return. He climbed toward it the way a drowning man climbs toward light. On the 3rd Saturday in January, 2 days after the world learned his name, Walter Brennan opened his eyes. Dr. Dime. Okafor was there, and a nurse named Pat, and Camille, the estranged daughter who had flown in the moment she heard, and now sat stiff and uncertain at the bedside of a father she had spent 3 years not forgiving. Walter's eyes moved across the ceiling, across the faces, slow and unfocused, and the room held its breath, and his daughter leaned in and said his name. And he looked at her without recognition. The doctor said his name. The nurse said his name. They were all certain in those first seconds that the first thing a returning man reaches for is the face he loves most, and they arranged themselves to be that face. And Walter Brennan, who had clawed his way back up a dark and endless water toward a single voice, wet his cracked lips, and in a rasp that barely cleared the machines, said a name that belonged to none of them. "Tessa," he said. "Where is Tessa?" No one in the room knew who Tessa was. His daughter looked at the doctor looked at the nurse. The vice president by the window frowned and checked his phone as though the name might be a client. The man had been unconscious for 4 months, had a daughter at his side and a company combing the state for him, and the first word out of his mouth was the name of a person not one of them could place. Camille, hurt and bewildered, asked who Tessa was, and her father, too weak to explain, only said it again, the same 2 syllables, with the whole of his returning strength. "Find her," she read to me. "Find her." It was Pat, the night nurse, who set down her clipboard and said slowly that she knew exactly who Tessa was. They found her 2 floors down, on her knees, scrubbing a scuff from the linoleum outside a supply closet, $11 an hour, the second to last hour of her shift. Pat came down in the elevator and walked the corridor and found her there with the bucket and the grey water, and Tessa looked up at the older woman's face and went cold, because she thought she was about to be told the man had died. Pat crouched down to her level, the way you do when the news is too big to deliver standing up, and she said, "He woke up, honey. He woke up, and he is asking for you. He said your name." Tessa Wills sat back on her heels on the wet floor and pressed her hand to her mouth and did not say a word. The bucket sat beside her, the rag dripped in her other hand, and 4 months of evenings rose up in her all at once. She had read to a man who could not hear her. Everyone had said. And the man had heard every word. The first thing he reached for when he came back across the dark was the sound of her. She did not believe it until she stood in the doorway of 412 and saw him looking at her. Lou. He was propped up now, thin and old and astonished, and the room was full of important people who turned to see who had come in, and his eyes frowned her over all their heads, and his face broke open. "There you are," he said. The voice, "I know your voice." He lifted a hand that shook and held it out to her, and Tessa crossed the room past the lawyers and the daughter and the vice president, and she took the hand of a stranger she had read to for 4 months, and the stranger wept, and she wept, and the important people stood awkwardly at the edges of something they had no part in and could not buy their way into. "You stayed," Walter said. Nobody stayed. "You stayed." He could not say much that first day. But over the next week, as his strength came back in pieces, the story assembled itself, and the people around him learned what the floor cleaner had done, and the learning humbled them in a way no lecture could have. The doctor told Camille that her father had been adrift, with no anchor, medically speaking, and that the one consistent stimulus across his entire recovery had been the daily reading of a hospital custodian, who was not paid to do it, and not asked to do it, and not anyone's idea of important. The board's vice president, who had spent 4 months unaware his chairman was alive, stood in the corridor and could not meet Tessa's eyes. Camille, who had flown in Brace to bury her grievances along with her father, found instead a living man and a stranger who had loved him for free, and something in her that had been clenched for 3 years began, slowly, to come loose. Walter wanted to know everything. He wanted to know about Marcus, and the honor roll, and Joy, and the tooth, and the radiator that knocked, because he had heard all of it from inside the dark, and it had become as real to him as his own history. He asked Tessa to bring her children. She did, nervous, on a Sunday in their church clothes, with the long bus ride spent reminding Marcus to say "sir," and reminding herself that this was not a job interview, even though her stomach insisted it was. Marcus stood very straight and shook the old man's hand and answered every question in complete sentences, and Joy climbed onto the foot of the bed without being asked and told Walter that her tooth had come in crooked, and showed him, leaning in so close he could have counted them, and Walter Brennan, $200 million and 40 years of empire. Thatch laughed for the first time since the ditch, and the laugh turned into something wetter at the end that he hid by asking Joy whether the tooth fairy had improved her rates. He asked that Sunday how she had come to sit with him. Tessa told him the truth, that he had been a man in a room with no one, and she could not bear it, and that was all. There was no calculation in it, no knowledge of who he was, nothing she had wanted from him, because he had been no one and had nothing to give. Walter listened to that, an old man who had spent his whole life unable to tell who wanted his money and who wanted him, and he understood that he had finally met someone who had chosen him when he was worth precisely nothing, and the understanding landed on him like grace. What happened next, Walter did with care, because he had learned the hard way that money thrown at a good person can crush what made them good. He did not show up at the apartment on Holloway Street with a check the size of a billboard. He did not turn Tessa into a headline. Instead, he asked her plainly what she would want if she could have it. And Tessa, who had never once let herself answer that question, sat by his bed and finally did. She said she wanted Marcus and Joy to go to college without it breaking them. She said she wanted to stop being afraid of $40. She said it the way a person says a thing they have never let themselves say out loud, slowly, testing whether the floor would hold. She told him about Marcus at the window on the first of the month, watching for white envelopes. And she watched something move across the old man's face when she said it, because Walter Brennan had been a boy once too, in a house where the envelopes were the enemy before the trucks and the millions. And he had spent 40 years making sure he would never feel that particular fear again, and had never once thought to wonder who was still feeling it. She said, almost too quiet to hear, that she had always wanted to go back to school herself, to become a nurse, to be the one holding the hand instead of mopping around the bed, but that the wanting had felt like a door painted on a wall. She had looked at that painted door for 15 years, she said, and she had taught herself not to reach for the handle, because there was no handle, and a person could go mad reaching for a handle that was only paint. Walter Brennan made the door real. He set up an education fund for Marcus and Joy that would carry them as far as their minds could go, untouchable in their names. He paid off the apartment on Holloway Street and bought the building it stood in so the rent that had terrified her could never be raised on her again, and he put it in a trust she controlled. And he made one call to the dean of the nursing program at the State College, not to buy Tessa a seat she had not earned, but to make sure that the cost of the seat she earned would never be the thing that stopped her. Then he stepped back, because he had come to understand that the dignity of what she had done was the whole point. And you do not honor a gift by erasing the giver's freedom to have given it. Tessa went back to school that fall. She kept her job at Belhaven for the first year because she would not be a person who forgot where she came from, mopping the same floors in the morning and studying anatomy at night. And the nurses who had watched her sit with a John Doe now watched her learn to be one of them, and Pat cried at her white coat ceremony as though Tessa were her own. Walter recovered slowly and never fully. He walked with a cane after that and tired easily, and handed the daily running of Brennan freight to people he trusted, because the ditch had taught him that an empire is a poor thing to die alone for. He spent the years he had left differently. He reconciled with Camille, the work of it slow and real, made of small Sundays and hard conversations and a great deal of silence, sat through without leaving the room. The thing that had broken between them 3 years before had been money, the way it so often is, a business he had wanted her to enter and a life she had wanted. Instead, and he had said unforgivable things about her choices, and she had stopped answering the phone. None of that had changed. What had changed was that Camille had stood at his bedside and heard him ask, before he asked for her, for a stranger, and instead of the old jealousy she had felt something crack open, because she had finally understood that her father's hunger was not for control, but for someone, anyone, to have stayed, and that she could be one of the people who stayed if she chose it. The bridge that carried them back to each other was of all things a floor cleaner from Holloway Street, because Camille could not stay angry at a father a stranger had loved back to life, and Walter could not keep at arm's length a daughter who had flown across the country the moment she thought she might lose him. He bought a small house 4 blocks from Tessa's and showed up for Marcus's basketball games and sat in the bleachers like any old man, a cane hooked on the rail and a paper program rolled in his fist, shouting at the referees in a voice that still carried after 40 years of using it. He learned the names of Marcus's teammates. He kept a tin of butterscotch candies in his coat pocket that the whole bench knew about by the second season. Joy called him Mr. Walter, and then by the second year, just Grandpa, and no one corrected her because no one wanted to, and the first time she said it, he had to set down his coffee and look out the window for a while. And Tessa let him and pretended not to see, which is its own kind of mercy. People ask Tessa sometimes, when the story got around the way such stories do, whether she had known, whether some instinct had told her the man in 412 was somebody. She always said no, and she always said it the same way, that the not knowing was the whole point, that you do not get to find out a person is worth your kindness before you give it, that you give it first into the quiet to a stranger who can do nothing for you, and you let the worth take care of itself. She had not sat with Walter Brennan because he was rich. She had sat with him because he was alone, and being alone was the one wealth and the one poverty she understood all the way down. 3 years after the day he said her name, Walter Brennan died in his sleep in the small house 4 blocks away, an old man who had spent his last years surrounded by people who wanted nothing from him but his company. Tessa was a nurse, by then in her 2nd year on the floor, and she was the one the family called. And she came in her scrubs and sat with him the way she had sat with him once before, except this time she knew his name, and this time she was not afraid he was alone, because he was not. She read to him again at the end, the last chapter of the book, about the man who sailed home after 20 years away, and whether he heard it or not she could not say, but she had learned long ago that you read anyway. You read into the quiet, you stay. In his will, in his own shaking hand, he had left her a letter and a single line of bequest. The letter said only what he had said the day he woke, that nobody stayed and she had stayed, and that he had spent his whole life being valued for what he had and had died being loved for who he was, and that she had given him that, and it was the only thing he had ever owned that mattered. The bequest beside it was small on purpose, because the big things he had already done while he lived. It was the worn paperback with the lighthouse on the cover, the one she had read to him first, 4 pages on a Tuesday, to a man who could not hear her. He had kept it on his nightstand for 3 years. She keeps it on hers now. The spine is cracked all the way through, and the cover is soft as cloth from handling. And on the nights when the floor of the world tilts and she is tired, in a way sleep does not fix, she takes it down and reads a few pages aloud into the quiet of her own bedroom, to no one, the way she once read to a stranger, because she has learned that the quiet is never as empty as it seems, and that somewhere, always, someone is climbing toward the sound of a voice that simply refused to stop. If a stranger's kindness ever pulled you back from somewhere dark, tell me about it, because those are the stories the world forgets to keep. And if this one stayed with you, there is another I want to tell you about a man who gave away his last $20 to a woman at a bus stop and what he found in his mailbox 1 year later to the day.